that's for me, living life so merrily. It's so easy, can't you see? Polka, polka, that's for me. Polka, polka, everyone, come along, it's lots of fun. Send your troubles on.
April 11th, and it's Miguel Dorati here with the Talk and Shoot podcast. We're going to stick with the boxing theme for Talk and Shoot this week. We had a nice podcast last week with guests Keith Palmer and Michael Davis. I've invited them both back this week to get more into the world of boxing and talk about, an old-time boxing theme, and that is, who is the greatest of all time? It's a discussion that you're never going to complete, but we want to add our thoughts on it. I think, with Keith, as we know with Keith, I met Keith many years ago. He's always been involved in boxing, and he was the boxing coach for a team of MMA fighters that was coming up in the sport. Comes from a boxing family. Mike Davis always helps on the podcast, a promoter, longtime enthusiast of boxing, 60 amateur fights, and they're both fond of the history of the sport, and that's what we want to get into here. It's a little bit of the history of the sport. You guys with me?
Yes, I'm here.
Cool. That's Keith and Mike, and what I want to do is I want to say, let's keep this discussion to fighters that are already retired. This is going to help us, what I'm looking for a little bit is almost a scholastic type of analysis of, does this certain boxer belong in the discussion of the best of all time? And
so what you're saying is no Floyd Mayweather talk?
Exactly. I'd like to rule out Floyd. I'd like to rule out Klitschko. I think that their camps are going to mount campaigns for them because of numbers, based around numbers, wins in a row and that sort of stuff, are going to mount campaigns on them that they may actually get some people to believe that they're the best of all time, and I think I can make a strong argument against them.
They can, but I'm going to make a strong argument. There's two sports that take up a lot of heavyweights that, like in the early 1900s, did, and it's mixed martial arts and pro football.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's one point against Klitschko. I don't like that, basically, Klitschko's got the resources in Germany and stuff that you're going to, it's like fighting Mayweather in Vegas. I'm not impressed with Mayweather sitting at home fighting all the time without taking a road fight here and there just to prove things. Klitschko every once in a while does it, but Klitschko's notorious because he comes at you with a German entourage of lawyers and stuff, and they all make their demands, and he gets exactly what he wants. So it's never a situation where they're fighting, in hostile territory. And I think that would eliminate them from what our real discussion will be, which is who the greatest of all times were. And I think, like I said, when we get into the details, there's probably about 20 fighters that you could really legitimately make a case for. So let's start. I'm going to bounce the first name here, and we'll just go with the Muhammad Ali, the biggest name of all time. I think we could all agree that if we're going to select 16 at this process, that he will probably be one of those 16. Anybody want to speak against Mr. Ali?
Nah, I would never do that. It's not sacrilege.
I plan on returning her.
And it's interesting. I'll tell you from my perspective. I'm because of my age, I saw Ali at the end of his career, and you really got to go back and look at the whole thing. If you're just counting on your own experiences and stuff, I didn't see enough of Ali personally. I had to go back to really appreciate him, and he also gets a lot of credit for his extra ring stuff. The civil rights stuff, and just that he's so iconic throughout the world. And I'm just talking about what he did in the ring. He belongs in this discussion.
Oh, for sure. I'm not. Lately, I've been kind of debating on whether I have him as the number one heavyweight of all time or Joe Louis, but that's kind of beside the point. Both of them should be in there.
So. Let's go ahead and take up Joe Louis as the next name. I remember when we were bouncing a list around between us before, in preparation for this show, that I'd actually forgotten Joe Louis, and it was Keith that reminded me, so I'll let you talk a little bit about Joe's credentials.
He was the heavyweight champion for 12 years straight when there was one heavyweight champion.
Yeah, and it's particularly...
Yeah, post-Schmeling, of course.
And it's particularly his records that Klitschko is going for, just to tie in our conversation.
Yeah, some of the issues that you have when you're piling lists like that, there's so many different factors. How were they in their prime? Did they hang it up at the proper time? Or did they try to stretch out a few more fights at the end to try to save up some money? It's like a list like this, I believe, should kind of concentrate on a fighter's prime and their dominance during such. And Joe Louis, he cannot be left off a list like this.
Yeah,
any fighter in history that's sat in front of Joe Louis got knocked out.
I agree, Mike, to a certain extent. I think later on in the discussions we can bring in, a particular point in time for each fighter. Was Ali better in 71 or in 63 or 64? With Joe Louis, he's just got such a long body of work that, I think we've got two names that have advanced here. Let's get through some of the...
That's tragically, too. Like the United States government goes after him for tax evasion after him taking a bunch of fights to donate money to the armed forces. Ridiculous. So go ahead. I apologize.
No. I understand. And let's keep chugging through the list here. I think another no-brainer, and our first little man in this discussion is going to be Henry Armstrong. Armstrong is a contemporary of Joe Louis, and in a way, he it's hard to say, but pound for pound, he may actually have been better than Joe Louis. I think Joe Louis may actually have said, I learned a lot of boxing and a lot of boxing technique from Henry Armstrong. Armstrong stood in the shadow of Louis, and in his moment, though, he captured 3 of the existing 8 world championships and held all 3 belts at once. This was in the midst of a streak of something along the lines of 24, 25 knockouts in a row, or a number of that type. So, I think...
He was also a guy, he had some really cool nicknames, too. And I think he used to... I know he fought in 4 different weight classes, but it was Homicide Hank, Hurricane Hank, Hammering Hank. He was just constantly someone...
Yeah.
Was, almost reinventing himself to scare the guy across from him. That's one of the things I enjoyed about Henry.
That's the thing, too, we talked about him having three world championships at one time, but he also had a draw against the middleweight champion, Sefrino Garcia.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a guy that potentially could have won, has four championships pretty much almost at the same time. And if you count in the junior titles from now, that's almost like 7 championships in a row. You're talking a guy that could have been featherweight, junior lightweight, junior welterweight, junior middleweight, and middleweight, possibly at the same time.
And at this time, there wasn't a real commission, or there wasn't a commission period, I should say. And some of these decisions and rounds were pretty shady depending on what hometown he fought in. So when he's fighting, like you said, Keith, when he's going in there and winning championships, he's fighting in someone's hometown and doing it. And to say that he got a draw, that's a fight that you should probably watch and score on your own, rather than just kind of take it what it's worth and what you read.
So we're going to advance Henry Armstrong. I'm going to go with... Go ahead, Keith. I'm sorry.
Paper. Oh, it was just the newspaper decisions and stuff like that.
Where there was no newspaper saying to one. That's just it. That's just garbage.
That's the fortunate part is we have YouTube now, so we can judge these fighters for the most part, other than Harry Greb. So.
Yeah, I know that's. Let's go ahead and go to Harry then. I know Harry's a guy that I know Springs Toledo, one of the existing boxing historians and authors that's out there now, did an extensive work and settled on Harry Greb as actually the greatest of all time after his exercise. I know he's got a lot of support with that, including yours, Keith, I think. Why don't you go ahead and talk about Harry?
Harry Greb is my favorite fighter of all time. Of course, I've never actually seen footage of him fighting. I've only seen footage of him working out because as of right now, there is no footage that exists, and we don't know if there's ever going to be any found. But luckily, we did see some footage of him working out. It looks kind of awkward to your average person because he looks funny shadowboxing, does some things that, to the average eye, you're just kind of like, what's going on here? But here's the thing, he had 300 fights. He had 42 fights alone, 45 fights alone in 1919. That's crazy. We're talking about guys like Mayweather. We don't, but other people talk about guys like Mayweather. You're talking a guy that had as many fights as Mayweather has had in his entire career in 1 year.
Absolutely.
It's crazy.
Not only that, they say his fighting style, he was obviously called the Pittsburgh Windmill, but his fighting style was he just swarmed people with combinations. You know, at a time where people were just trying to one punch and set up that big right hand, this guy was throwing combinations and just smothering his opponents. But then also, like, he had the knowledge and fortitude to, like, the championship rounds, like the 12th, 13th, 14th round on up. That's what his strongest rounds were. You know, it's like, you know, a lot of these guys back then, they were doing the road work and stuff, but this guy was genetically special on top of, you know, being a champion.
But here's the thing, too, and he beat Gene Tunney. He's the only guy to beat Gene Tunney
to a pulp.
Yeah, and the thing is that there's a good possibility that he was blind in one eye when he beat Gene Tunney. We don't know. We can't tell. I mean, I've heard it was with Kid Norfolk. That's when he had the injury, but a detached retina. So at the very least, he fought with a detached retina and beat Gene Tunney, who most people think, a lot of people think, could be the greatest heavyweight of all time.
Yeah, Gene will come up in this discussion later. To add another point to that, I noticed this about it because, you know, if you want to argue Tunney doesn't belong on this list, Tunney also did beat Harry Greb 4 times just from size and skill, and Harry's the only person who ever broke through to beat him. What I find interesting is, so he's fighting Tunney. You know, if you look at it, either it's his 3rd or 4th fight with Tunney, and you know, he's got to have an idea. Harry Greb's got to know, all right, I got Gene Tunney, I'm going to fight Gene Tunney here in a couple of days, and he's got to know it's a tough fight. He's already fought him a few times and lost to him. So, but he'd fight 2 days before. You know, 2 days before going to fight Tunney again, he's taking on guys, you know, in club shows and stuff. I think if you look back at his September 24th meeting, he fought somebody a couple of days before that fight, and it's I think that's just a tribute to you know, the mentality of a fighter like that.
Is it the mentality, or do you think he was broke? Which one is it?
No. I think he had money. I just think he liked to fight.
Yeah, I don't know that much about his particular circumstances, but he doesn't strike me as that kind of guy, especially with the respect that he's gotten in the industry there. I'm just looking at the...
And I know we're going off topic here, but can you imagine being the promoter? You sold thousands of tickets to him versus Tunney, and the guy's fighting 2 days prior.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that just doesn't happen anymore. And I always, you know... One of the things that people talk about with the old-timers is, well, how would they do today? And, you know, I counter that with saying, okay, let's take Mayweather back to 1924 and see how we do with a couple of fights in a week. You know, and it's just a completely different ballgame. But I think more of those guys would show their talent under now, the circumstances now, than guys fighting now would be able to show themselves then, just because the pressure and the mindset was just completely different.
Well, that's the thing with a guy like Harry Greb. You didn't have to worry about Harry Greb pulling out the fight. He would have showed up and fought no matter what. If he had a cut, he was fighting. If he was injured,
yeah, I think in his seventh bout, he broke his broken arm in his bone, and that's one of his first losses.
That would be a bone in his arm.
He finished the round. He just, you know, couldn't continue after that because he broke his arm. Yeah, Greb was a real man.
So now we talked Harry. I think we should give Gene Tunney the pass here too, because there's not a lot that can be said about Gene other than, you know, the perfect record, the man that beat the man, you know, with taking out Jack Dempsey and stuff, and you know, with the only loss on his career to Greb, I think that of all the great things you talk about Greb, that's usually one of the first bullets or, you know, things that people say to elevate Greb when they're discussing him. So I think that almost by virtue puts Tunney in the discussion, even though, you know, he doesn't come with the popularity or you know, the hype of certain fighters.
I agree.
Now I'm going to take this into more interesting territory, because I think a lot of what happens in some of these discussions is people get emotional and they want to talk about their favorite fighter or a moment that they somehow have an association with, you know. What greater thing than having been first row at a certain fight or things like that. So you elevate a guy in your mind. I like the purely, you know, mathematical approach, and because of that, that's my introduction to Archie Moore. because Archie is one of the an all-time great, obviously, a very prolific fighter, and BoxRec. For all you can critique BoxRec's formula puts him as the number one fighter of all time. Springs Toledo put Greb as the number one fighter of all time. Now we're getting into a little bit of a different input here. And what BoxRec does is they take the emotion out of it. They have a mathematical formula, and what you can credit that and discredit it. But the thing is you can tweak the formula, but nobody's putting this guy high on the list because he doesn't have something to back it up. So I'm going to open the discussion with Archie Moore because there's some people that don't rate him in these discussions.
That would be insane. I mean, you're talking about a guy that's got like 220 fights and, fought at middleweight, light, heavyweight, and heavyweight. And, okay, Archie Moore, in my opinion, is the type of guy that not only was a world champion in the ring, he emanated it and was a world champion out of the ring. Like, he was doing the whole inner city thing, getting kids in boxing, talking to them. The type of character he was, both inside and outside of the ring, they don't even have that. I mean, people aren't like that anymore, and it's a shame. It really is a shame. And he also, I believe, had coached Muhammad Ali, George Foreman, and James Tillis. And I know Ali left his camp to go with Dundee later on in his career, but both Foreman and Ernie Shavers have went on record stating that, their punching power greatly increased when, Archie Moore showed them how to punch and kind of helped them with the mechanics of boxing. Yeah, Archie Moore, in my opinion, if he's not number one, he's number two.
And Keith,
if you're gonna include Archie Moore, in my opinion, you have to include Ezra Charles, though. And if the only reason, if the fact that Ezra Charles was 3-0 against Archie Moore and stopped him the last time they fought. Ezra Charles, a lot of people look at the Marciano fights. He was past his prime.
Exactly.
So, but if you're actually going to judge Ezra Charles, you got to judge Ezra Charles pretty much about from Joe Louis, Walcott fights, and before. He was 2-0 against Charlie Burley when nobody would fight Charlie Burley. Ezra Charles was as dominant a fighter at light heavyweight as any fighter in history. I don't have a disagreement with Archie Moore being there, but I do think that Ezra Charles, time for time, was the better fighter.
Okay, and both names are obviously going to be legit in this discussion at some point. I think one of the knocks on Moore, and it's just historical facts and stuff, is there's never going to be solved the discussion of what his true age really was. And it does weigh in on my thinking of, where was his prime? Where can we really say he was at his prime, and what was he doing then? And that's something that I think knocks him down a little bit in my book. I agree about Ezra Charles. I feel like that's another one of those lost eras where, if you look at their records, and there was a series of, I don't want to say B class because I don't want to put them down, but there was a series of guys that never attained the world championship in that era that were extremely, extremely tough guys with, dozens of fights, and the level of competition through and through there is just crazy. It's just crazy.
Oh, guys like Jimmy Bivens and Eddie Booker, those guys would have been world champions in any other era. Like Eddie Booker knocked out Archie Moore, knocked him out, and a couple fights later retires because he has an injury. It's a guy that was pretty much 63-5, 63-4, and nobody really knows who he is. It's amazing that the level of guys that were around at that time, and that's one thing that I have to give a guy like Joey Maxim credit for. A period when a lot of white fighters were not fighting all of the best black fighters, Joey Maxim was fighting everybody.
Yeah. And Eddie Cotton too could be thrown into that mix. I mean, it's an amazing period of history because, like Miguel, Keith, you had stated. I mean, there's certain guys that have fought more times in 1 year than an entire career of someone like Floyd Mayweather today. And, I mean, there's years where Archie Moore would fight 10, 12 times. I mean, you're talking once a month. You know, against top competition. It's not like you're just going to, the local bingo hall. I mean, it's like they're constantly throwing guys at him that are, they're trying to get him beat. And that's incredibly impressive, in its own right.
I have no argument with any of those guys. From any of those light heavyweights there, I can't make an argument against them. I can make arguments for them, but I can't make arguments against them.
Right.
Yeah, and like to throw in just another toss in the names, I was doing a little fact checking there. I didn't want to get it wrong. But like I was talking about that second tier of guys that provided these guys with competition. I mean, you're talking about guys like Rex Lane or Lee Oma, Freddie Beach, Joe Cahoot. These guys are tough guys with a lot of fights. And that era must have really been some fun watching.
Oh, yeah, you have the Elmer Rays and the Curtis Shepherds and those kind of guys. I mean, those guys they're unreal. I mean, those guys are the kind of guys that could be champions today, and I would pick them to be champions today if they were fighting. And nobody really knows who they are. There was 60 of those guys back then.
Yeah. Let me go back here and go back to the little guys. I think we missed one no-brainer that we could spend a little bit of time on, but I don't think anybody's going to argue against Sugar Ray Robinson.
No. I can't argue that. Yeah,
it goes unsaid. So, absolutely.
But we don't know exactly how this theme of the greatest of all time is going to develop. I have in my idea of having 8 heavyweights and 8 men of other divisions, and maybe doing I don't know if it's a pound for pound bracket or 2 8-man brackets or something like that. But we've just set up the possibility of a Henry Armstrong Sugar Ray Robinson meeting. So I think that's interesting in this discussion. Let's stick with the little guys. I'm going to go back to Joe Gans because the old master is, I think, somebody that is really underappreciated. I think he's actually the first black champion, ever, if you consider American sports, coming, in the late 1890s, he won the lightweight belt. And, when you consider that's just 30 years after, the Emancipation Proclamation and the release of the slaves, he really is a historic figure that, predates Jack Johnson. And the type of things that he went through to fight they have to be something that would be considered, inhumane at this point in time.
I agree.
To go into, like, the stories of his fights with Battling Nelson in Utah, and there's some great lore that goes along with Joe Gans, and so the news is out there, but hopefully we're touching an audience here that is hearing stuff and getting interest in the history of boxing for the first time. But back in the 1900s, he faced Battling Nelson out west for the lightweight title, and the habit at that time was that people would send telegrams and things, and that they've got 20,000 people in the audience, many of the people from the mining towns around, many people travel by train. Teddy Roosevelt, the president's son, attended some of these fights, when he went out to Utah by train in Nevada and the desert out there. And so Gans shows up to fight Battling Nelson. Now Gans, the telegram that was read that we all know now is that his mom or somebody in his family sent, in reference to him winning and coming home with money, said, "You bring home that bacon." And we still use that saying today in some way, shape, or form, and it's said to have originated with Joe Gans. But what's amazing here with this whole thing is here he shows up to fight Nelson in Utah, and when he shows up, they tell him, "Hey, listen, I know we guaranteed you X amount of money, but we're going to pay you half." And Gans just had a fight. He had no choice. He really had no choice but to bring home some bacon. So that's a situation where a guy's greatness comes out because, under those circumstances, what kind of fight could you really expect as a promoter? Well, Joe Gans went and fought 40 rounds after they cut his purse in half. That's a man of a different cloth.
And not only that, like you said, it was a different time. The guy died at 35. He had 200 fights, roughly, by the age of 35, and he died of, I think it was tuberculosis.
Yeah.
2 years after one of his losses. So
he was already, the disease was already raging during his last fights, and in fact, when he lost the championship, he was already affected by it. Yeah, I think Joe Gans is somebody that we can put in this discussion.
Yeah, he's got to be there. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, you always kind of wonder. Boxing's made up of styles, and of course, this day and age of social media and accessibility, where everything's at your fingertips. You wonder if his style is still applicable today, and even if it wasn't, his durability and toughness could probably win him a lot of fights, even with guys that are studying film on him.
Yeah, I think he's one of those guys that probably has the potential to cross over, because he was actually using some pretty scientific boxing techniques back then. And personally, I think there was probably a time in the 30s and 40s where boxing, where it kind of peaked as far as the knowledge base, and I think it started to go back down, obviously, with the caliber of guys that we have now. But a guy like Gans, he can fight anybody at any time. I don't buy that stuff.
I agree. That's going to be a good segue to our next guy, because our next guy is a scientist, and he's also from back in the day, so to speak. And I'm going to talk about Benny Leonard. I agree in certain terms. The guys that come to us through time with a reputation as being teachers and students, being people who developed and made techniques, the bolo punch, the first guy, this sort of stuff. Those guys, I think, are the easiest to say they would do well in nowadays, because you just put them in a gym and they're going to say, wow, what is that? And okay, that machine simulates running, and I run all the time. Let me see. And they'll adapt to all the stuff. They're smart. They were learning back then. They would learn now. And what they had was the physical tools, but more than anything, the mental toughness. And I think Leonard exemplifies that.
The big thing that Leonard has going for him, in my opinion, is when you read the stuff that Ray Arcel said about him. And Ray Arcel, that was pretty, I think him, Benny Leonard, and a guy named Benny Valger were his two favorite fighters. And I'm not sure that Arcel ever thought Duran could beat Benny Leonard. I think he was such a nice guy that he never quite said it, and he would never come out and say it. But in his head, he knows that would have been a great fight. You're talking a guy that was, 1915 to the mid-1920s. Obviously, a guy like Arcel can look at that and be like, there is no decline in the scientific skill there. So he knew a guy that spent the whole 1900s watching the best fighters, training the best fighters. He never talked about a decline or some kind of a scientific gap there. And I don't think it existed, personally.
Okay.
He was one of the first fighters that made a considerable amount of money. And, he was from the Jewish ghetto in New York, and he made a considerable amount of money, and he crapped out in the stock market. And he was one of the first guys, like Floyd Mayweather, actually, I don't mean to keep bringing his name up, that retired and then came back because he had to. And, in the 23 fights he had coming back, I think he only lost, like 2 of them. I want to say 2 or 3 of them. I'm going from memory here. But
I think he had a draw and he lost to McLaren, and that's it. He had reeled off like 17 in a row.
Jack Britton, I think he lost to. I guess I'm going.
Yeah, but I don't think that was after the comeback. That was before the comeback. It was a loss.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. But no, I mean, that's incredibly impressive. Like, everyone that we're talking about right now is a world champion, and now we're trying to come up with the best of the best. And when you look at something on paper, it's certainly not easy.
Leonard is a guy that like Muhammad Ali and like another handful of people, perhaps from this era, where you've got just so much that he's already in this discussion because he did so much and their resume is so incredible. But you also have that curse of, like, you lost 3, 4, 5 years in their prime, that what could have been during those times. That also happens with Greb to a certain extent because he passed away so young. So I think Leonard sullied his legacy because even though he won all those fights in his comeback, a lot of the reviews and things I read there were not very complimentary of him during that comeback.
I know a couple of newspapers that I had read in regards to it. They said I think they had issues with his fighting style. It was more of like a grab and punch, kind of holding.
I think you could. I agree. There's a lot of things that we won't know all the factors. I think another factor here, though, is like for example, especially during the comeback, and you look at it, he was Jewish. The Jews in that era already had like a Barney Ross. They'd already replaced him, I think, in his 5 years of being away. So he was already something that was looked at as being older. And then when he faces a guy like McLaren, you're running into, the whole Irish community of people in the press and things. I mean, McLaren was a babyface. I think it's the title of the book that was written about him by J.J. Johnston. But he was, for the time, one of the most popular fighters in the world, and that had to do with ethnicity back then a lot. And I think that caught Leonard by surprise. And not by surprise, but that's one of the things that made the end of Leonard's career a little bit uglier.
Yeah, cool nickname too, the Ghetto Wizard.
Yeah, I really would love, he's a guy that, if you had a time machine, I'd pay a visit to one of his fights somewhere, deep down in maybe at the Garden, packed Garden, but I'd rather see one, at one of the athletic clubs somewhere, with 300 people in the room, still smoking while they're boxing, that kind of thing,
Right. Right.
And so Keith, so we got Benny Leonard in there, we got Joe Gans in there. You mentioned Roberto Duran, and I got him on this list because I wanted to pull in some of the more modern people, some of the people we've seen. And Roberto Duran is one of the guys that, most people, the big fights that most people saw or remember, at least, at the very end, not at the end of his career, but they came beyond lightweight, and he is a true lightweight phenomenon, I think. I think that's where he belongs if we had to pick a point in time.
Yeah, Duran, in my opinion, I think Arcel actually said this when he went down to Panama to take a look at him. He said, hey, let's not mess this up. This guy is something special. Let's just add to what he does. And I think as far as like a natural fighting machine, it's probably Duran and Greb that are the two most natural fighters ever.
Yeah, I think Duran is one of the guys you would have absolutely no problem, hey, we're going to take a time machine, Roberto, and we're going to go to like 1880, and you're going to fight this guy named Bob Fitzsimmons in a field. Duran would probably say, all right, and I don't know that too many other guys would.
Yeah. But you're going to fight, three other people prior to him within, a few days. Yeah, he would be fine with that. You're right.
Yeah, everything's out there with Duran. I mean, one of the things that's most impressive to me about Duran is he gave Marvin Hagler everything he could handle. Everything he can handle. And he's a lightweight. People talk about, look, this is a guy that kind of...
He's a lightweight.
Yeah, he's not a guy that put on a ton of muscle over the years. He's a guy that just got out there and fought. And that's probably one of the most impressive things to me is like, look, you took arguably one of the greatest middleweights of all time, neck and neck.
Speaking of neck, I got to meet Roberto Duran earlier in 2014. He came by Costa Rica for a little bit, and he's probably about 240 right now.
Good for him. Everybody deserves.
Yeah, I think he's living well, and he's living well, and he deserves to be in this discussion, I think. Now, we're coming down to some of the last names. Some of these people, we're out of place, out of sequence in time and stuff, but I think we can all agree that these guys belong in a discussion. Let's stay in the modern era. Let's stay with somebody else, because I'm going to, even though you just mentioned Marvin Hagler, I'm going to put Marvin Hagler in this discussion as well, just for, another one of those guys with that fighter mentality that I don't think you'd have a hard time getting him to fight, under different conditions. He was a man's man.
The greatest tragedy that for boxing over the past 40 years, in my opinion, is that we never got to see Monzon and Hagler. You can't argue against Hagler. I have no arguments against Hagler. Hagler, everybody loves Hagler.
No, he's 62-3, and that Sugar Ray fight. It was more of like almost like a pro wrestling thing. It was the baby face versus the heel, and that fight could have went either way on the scorecards. I mean, Hagler truly believed he won that fight when that final bell rang, and I remember. Go ahead.
That's testament. That fight there, though, is also testament to Sugar Ray Leonard's greatness. He hadn't fought in 4 years. He was coming off a detached retina, and and he got dropped in his last fight by a guy.
Yeah, real shitty performance in about right before that. Yeah.
And for him to come back and to arguably beat Hagler, well, maybe Leonard needs to be on here. You know, it's hard to say.
Leonard's one of those guys that I put on the bear margin. I think Leonard, in my opinion, and again, I didn't see him in his prime because I was too young, but in my opinion, he's a guy that his persona and some of that lend to his legend, kind of. And I don't know that in the ring a guy with limited fights and several retirements that lost that much of his prime and was that calculating belongs on the list. I think that's just my opinion, but Sugar Ray was one of the crossover guys. I chose Marvin Hagler over Sugar Ray despite the loss. I think Marvin walked away from the sport, you know, and it's a great lesson for everybody because you still see Marvin at the Hall of Fame inductions and he pops up every once in a while. I think he's still living overseas, but he made the most. He put away some money. You know, he's not dying, and he walked away and he said, you know what, you did me wrong. I'm fine with everything I've done. You know, and though I respect that, it's also bittersweet because you know he probably had 3 to 5 good performances left in his career there. But I think Marvin, for that era, it was the class of the field.
Well, what I really liked was, what I really liked about Hagler, I should say, is, you know, in 1986 he fought like an Olympic silver medalist from Uganda. I think it's John Mugabe, I think his name was.
Okay, John the Beast, ever.
Yeah, right. And they were supposed to fight, and the original date didn't work because Hagler had hurt his back. So, on the second date that was planned, his style was completely different than it was before. You know, it was almost as if like the injury didn't go away, so he adapted to a different style, or instead of like being real quick and slick, he was like more of a flat-footed guy that was just counter-punching and inside punching because, you know, he looked like he had hit a wall. Like, it was almost as if he was a different fighter. And he still continued to push forward, like, even with a different style.
So
I've got a little bit of a theory that, you know, that Hearns-Hagler fight took a lot out of Hagler. And I think that might have been his peak, and I think anything that came after that was the start of a decline. Because if you look at the Mugabe fight, I don't really know how good Mugabe actually was. Because he looked great against some guys coming up before Hagler. And then after that, Mugabe had a rough time. I mean, he got knocked out in one round by Terry Norris and some other guys. Gerald McClellan. It's hard for me to tell how good Mugabe was.
Okay.
Yeah, sometimes you shake someone's confidence, and it's like, you know, they fall off a horse and they just will not get back on it. And I think he's one of the guys that possessed the talent, but, you know, his head wouldn't allow him, you know, to be who he was physically.
I almost think it was a little more pride there, but let me go ahead and switch. We'll stay right in this era, talk about Carlos Monzon. He was mentioned as you know, maybe the great robbery of this last half century, not seeing Monzon Hagler. Take it away with Carlos.
I actually pick Carlos as being a greater middleweight than Hagler. You know, that is the big debate. I mean, you know, obviously Monzon's fighting in Argentina. We have video of him, but I mean, he was beating everybody that Hagler was. He was beating Benny Briscoe and Valdez. Rodrigo Valdez should be in the Hall of Fame. He was that good of a middleweight. He was beating Emil Griffith, Benvenuti. I personally put Monzon a little bit above Hagler, but I can see the argument for people that say Hagler.
I agree. I think right there you're talking about the class of the field for that era. Monzon, you know, had his own tragic ending many years later, but he left the sport with, you know, really on top as well.
Yeah. Well, Monzon Valdez too is a classic. That's like one of those must-watch fights. Like when people, you know, talk about the history of boxing, and you know, oh, Gotti Ward, you know, Hearns Hagler. I always try to throw in there Monzon Valdez too.
You know, I mean, the fact is
an amazing fight.
that was his last fight, and he walked away from the sport with, coming off a win. So Monzon, overall 87-3 record, basically probably one of the higher percentages on the list, since a lot of the guys maybe messed up their percentage a little bit later in their careers. We still got a couple of big names here to skip through.
I think Monzon's tough. Yeah, I think Monzon's toughest fights were in his house with his wives. By the way.
Hey, I have to throw something in there for anybody that's never seen the fight. Watch Rodrigo Valdez and Benny Briscoe. The KO. Benny Briscoe, I think it was the only time he was ever knocked out. It's a great knockout. So you definitely check that out if you haven't looked at it.
That's what you're here for, Keith. Thank you very much. And let's we still got a couple of names here. We got a couple of names that we left off the list that we wanted to talk about. But I'm going to go right with a couple of no-brainers. First, we're going to bring back Rocky Marciano, back to the heavyweight guys. Undefeated, people do knock him as a small heavyweight, and maybe in an era that the heavyweight division was considered down. Like you said, when he met Ezzard Charles, Ezzard was already a little bit past his prime. Besides that, you got to really look at Marciano as the dominant force in that era anyway. What are your thoughts here?
I personally have a hard time arguing against Marciano. There's reasons that I can't argue against him, but it's at this point, I think there was a time when Marciano was probably overrated, and I think he's probably underrated now because we've dissected his opponent so much. We talk about Ezzard Charles being up past his prime. We talk about Joe Louis. We talk about Walcott being past their prime. Even if those guys are past their prime, they're still great fighters.
Absolutely.
I mean, guys past their prime are
go ahead.
Yeah, they're unreal.
And that's and Marciano.
I think the one blip, the one fight that everyone talks about Marciano is the La Starza fight, and the referee essentially is the one that judged it for Marciano. I don't know. I mean, you can't argue. I mean, the guy, like Keith said, he fought a lot of guys on the downslope, like Jersey Joe Walcott. But Ezzard Charles, as you had already mentioned, even Archie Moore. But they were all older. He kind of cleaned up the old guys. And not to say that to disrespect them, but they certainly weren't in their prime. I mean, they're amazing names to have on your record, but in hindsight, they weren't in their prime. And that's the only strike against them.
Okay.
I have a hard. He's definitely one that I have a hard time evaluating because I know what Ezzard Charles was when he fought him, and it wasn't I don't think in his prime that Marciano beats Ezzard Charles. I don't think he beats Joe Louis, and I'm not sure he beats Walcott. Walcott was another older guy.
Yep.
I think he caught him a few years later, but I can't sit there and knock the guy because of when he came along.
Well, and right. I mean, it's a matter of when you're there. And then when Ingemar Johansson beat Floyd Patterson, who I met both of those guys in person as a child. When Ingemar Johansson won the title, Marciano was like, "Hey, I think I can beat this guy." I want to do a comeback. Well, now he's on the downslope of his career. Puts in a couple of months of training and says, "You know what? Yeah, this isn't for me." Like that internal toughness that we've talked about in the past with some of the guys that we've discussed in this, they wouldn't have said that. They would have said, if I want to fight Ingemar Johansson, I'm going to go and do it. And Marciano, decided to turn to TV as well as other aspects of his celebrity.
I don't know that that's a point against or a point for though, Mike. Because. I mean, once you're in how many guys have gone into the gym for Dempsey did it too. He went into the gym a couple of times and never came back, never actually pulled the trigger. And I think it's because they said, God, I've lost it. And if he knew himself well enough to say, look, I could still beat this guy, but I'm not what I used to be, and there's a risk. And he knew himself and didn't come back. We lament the number of bad comebacks that happen in boxing. So I think you got to kind of give him some respect.
You're correct. You can't argue that.
So
I'll tell you another guy who I really like is Willie Pep.
Let's go right to Pep. I got a couple of guys left on this list, and then we'll get into some of the extra ones here. But Willie Pep is another guy I think undeniably needs to be in this discussion.
In this discussion, I mean, up until this point, 90% of the people we've talked about are like 5'7" and under in height.
I don't think it gets any better here either. But I like Willie Pep. Willie Pep, a couple of quotes that jump out at me from memory. They say Sugar Ray Robinson's the best pound for pound, and because he was, a littler guy, he said, I'm the best ounce for ounce. And I like that attitude, but nothing really gives you any insight. I mean, if you don't know the Willie Pep story, I'll get into it here because the details of it are beautiful. He was hurt in some type of accident. They run together if it was a car accident or a plane accident. I think he actually crashed in a plane and survived, if I'm not mistaken. Broke his neck and was offered like a $500,000 insurance settlement because he had lost his income. He was a boxer professionally. He'd been boxing oh so long. Now with a broken neck, he'd never box again. And the insurance, all he had to do was sign he'd never box again, and he'd have $500,000, which you could live with in those days. And 6 months later, he was boxing again. Left the money with the insurance company, and came back to boxing and reached heights again. So I think that's just an incredible story. You got Pazienza in the modern era that did something similar, and every once in a while, one of those great comebacks from injury is an emotional story in boxing. I think in Willie Pep, you've got one of the greatest stories of all time.
Agreed.
Yeah, arguably the greatest defensive fighter of all time.
Yeah, I mean, he was the original guy that was on his heels going back, counterpunching. I mean, damn near 230 wins. One draw. I don't know. I mean, it's Willie Pep is absolutely first ballot Hall of Famer.
So now we got Willie Pep, Joe Gans, Roberto Duran. And what other one lightweight do we have? Benny Leonard. It's not a bad little four-man tournament.
Miguel, I apologize. I don't mean to retract, but like you were talking about taking a time machine. That guy fought Sugar Ray Robinson in an attic of a feed store in Connecticut, being outweighed by 25 pounds. That's the fight I would have wanted to go to.
Yeah, I think that's all good. That's all good. You know who we may want to visit here is the next guy. I would like to go see a Sam Langford fight circa 1907, 08, when he was a young man, and just to see what was going on there, because there's a lot of stories about Sam. Sam traditionally gets a lot of respect too, though, and he's like a Joe Gans, one of those guys that you hear Jack Johnson say, "Oh, he was the toughest I fought." You hear Dempsey say things like, Langford would have beat me, or I think something along those lines in his autobiography. A couple of things about Langford like that stick out. The one story I really like, the one that I really, I got choked up over it just because, he was begging for the fight with Dempsey. They wouldn't give it to him, and he retired blind and fades off into history. And somebody does a research project, and they find him living in an apartment in squalor in Boston in the 50s, living in, still blind and living off a check that he received monthly for the disability. And he wasn't a bitter man, and I think that's amazing.
He was one of the he fought in 5 different weight classes, and I think they referred to it as the color bar back then.
Yeah.
And, his title. And Jack Johnson also refused to fight him.
Of course. He's the guy that many people point to, the greatest fighter of all time who never held a world championship, and it was because the opportunity was denied him.
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting with Sam Langford is he actually, I believe when he was 18 or 19 years old, beat Joe Gans.
Yes.
But it was a non-title fight because he was a couple pounds overweight. And this is, you're talking an 18 or 19-year-old beating somebody else that we have on this list in their prime.
That's insane.
Yeah. And again, like I said, in the end of the interview, and I think it's actually could be on YouTube, Sam says, "I don't need anything. I'm happy. I still got my memories." And when you consider all the bitter stories that come out of boxing and all the, and here's the guy who, probably had legitimate reason for some bitterness, you know what I mean? If you're looking back at your life, never got a shot at a world title, living under poor circumstances because of the money, and, if you think back deeper, he was probably denied an education, and I mean, it just goes so deep.
He had nothing. He had nothing other than the two things at the end of his arms called fists.
And
that's all he had.
And the man is not bitter at the end. I think that says a lot about the character of the man. And not that plays into it here, but, when you're trying to really, what set him apart in the ring is he was comfortable in his own skin till the very end.
He was huge puncher. This is a guy that could have, honestly, if we're talking about it and we really have all the facts, Sam Langford may be the best of all time.
If you want to talk about, if you want to do some of the toughest fighters ever to live, Jack Blackburn, who was Joe Louis's trainer, he fought this guy 6 times. The first 3 fights were draws, which in Blackburn was the big name, at that time. So the first 3 were draws. Okay, you have to assume Langford got robbed there, And then the 4th was a decision, and then the 5th another draw, and the 6th a no contest. So essentially, he beat this Freddie Roach type trainer, 6 times.
I mean, there's some of those fights he fought Harry Wills so many times, Joe Jeanette so many times.
Yeah,
that's where I would love to see those fights, and I would love to, just get a feel for him, because it was just a different time, and there had to be certain fights where they took the fight off a little bit, or they didn't fight as hard as they wanted. They couldn't have tried to kill each other every single time. So I find that whole history very interesting, because the mindset's so different.
Do you think it was due to politics that he kept ending up on the wrong side of world championship decisions in terms of draws?
I think a lot of it was bad luck, because he did have a draw with the Barbados Joe Walcott, and he's another black fighter as well. Let's talk about him for a second. It's a guy that was 5'1".
Yeah,
we're talking about a 5'1" welterweight.
It's like Phil Johns.
I would have wanted to have seen that guy.
Yeah,
I want to see what he's about.
Exactly. I mean, that whole era. If you consider Kid Norfolk, Sam McVeigh, the second-tier guys that provides the competition for the upper echelon, and those guys are crazy. Sam McVeigh, in terms of modern history and stuff, Sam McVeigh did an MMA fight. I saw it on video somewhere on the internet. It's not on YouTube, but I caught it on a forum somewhere or something, and he did a fight against, they say jiu-jitsu in the description and stuff. I'm going to guess in France in 1910, it was a guy in a judo gi that was going to test his judo against McVeigh, and it's well worth watching all 10 seconds of it before McVeigh punches him once in the face. And it's just a completely different era of time and mindset and what the guys were willing to do, for a buck, and what they were willing to put themselves through. It's an amazing time.
I'd say that era as a promoter would be the greatest era to just kind of navigate.
If we had those guys to promote now, it would be interesting. Yep.
I have to throw one thing out there with Langford. Langford is one of those guys, and there is footage of Langford.
Yes.
If you watch the footage of Langford, he's one of those guys that you would have a hard time saying this guy couldn't fight now. Some of these guys you watch, and I think it has to do with the footage and the way it's sped up. It's old stuff. It's like watching an old movie, so it's not going to look the same. Mm-hmm. But Langford is one of those guys that anybody would be hard pressed to say, hey, he couldn't fight today. Because the stuff is there when you watch it, the subtle moves. You can see it when you watch Langford.
Yeah. I love, there's a story, too, about him fighting in England. The name of the British fighter, he was expected to be a world champion. It's going to escape me here for a minute. But it doesn't matter, because the story goes he was fighting, and the British guy got through and rattled Langford, shook him up a little bit with a punch. And, they're fighting at the National Club there in England, where supposedly at the time the rules were they're supposed to be silent. So you watch the fights in silence. People are not allowed to talk. But they had their upper crusty British, establishment there that people were standing up and kind of rocking back and forth and, holding their arms out for their British guy to knock Sam Langford into their arms, literally yelling at him something along the lines like, right here, right here. And Langford took it all in, knocked the guy out with one punch, went over to the ropes and told the crowd that had been yelling, right here, not there, he's over there. You can go pick up your boy over there. And, you know, on foreign territory, too, you know. I mean, in England, you know, the British, now in 2015, England has a reputation for not being a hospitable place to go fight. You know, I don't want to fight Tyson Fury in London in front of 60,000 people or any of those guys, because they count on that atmosphere, the intensity of it. And I think that comes from way back when nobody takes their boxing more seriously than the Brits. Even back then, they were already had clubs and establishments, and were working towards fairness, as you know, to an extent. And you've got Langford over there just performing and doing this thing, and just happy as a lark, joking with the crowd. And again, when I said he wasn't bitter at the end, I think there's so many stories like that about the guy where it's an anecdote, it's a funny twist at the end and stuff, and it's not just bitterness. And I love him.
All right, now, I mean, back to, I mean, let's toss. I got a couple of things.
We do have one more name on the list before we get into that.
I'll blow through this really quick.
Go.
Him and Jack Johnson fought one time in 1906. So back in that era, as we've established, these guys fight 4, 5, 6 times. You know, it's not unheard of. And although Langford got dropped in one of the earlier rounds, a lot of the people felt he won the overall fight, and Jack Johnson refused any types of rematches against him and used the whole, well, you know, I command a $30,000 appearance fee, this guy won't give it to me. So essentially it's, I want to take both purses, otherwise I'm not fighting you again. I mean, he belongs on that list. You know, he's one of my favorite fighters of all time.
It's funny that comes up too, because fighters do that now. You know, you got Carl Frost. You got Carl Frost denying.
He's fighting in England. He's fighting all over the world. Commercial air travel didn't start until like
no, they went on boats.
1916. So this guy went on a boat.
Yeah, I mean, and he probably got off a train and fought a few hours later, half a dozen times in his career, if not, you know, way more. But
that's insane.
I can almost assure you that he, you know, took a train from Boston to, you know, Harrisburg to do a fight and that sort of stuff. So, yeah, it's crazy. We're going to wrap up the top guys that I brought to the table. Then we'll address the guys that you want to hear here. And I'm going to go back to the modern era and back to the heavyweights. And I'm going to pick Evander Holyfield for this discussion. You know, this is a fighter I've watched, and I know, and I grew up with him. So it's not like I've watched him like some of the other guys in retrospect. I lived those fights. And in this era, you know, you've got Lennox Lewis. He's a little bland, although he's excellent. You can, you know, going back a little bit, maybe you got Larry Holmes there, who's got a fantastic resume and stuff. But I picked Holyfield. Obviously, you got Tyson. I picked Holyfield because of all of them. I thought Holyfield was the one with the most of that spirit that we're talking about, that indomitable, like fighting hurt and things like that. Like Tyson never really fought hurt. When he got hurt, he seemed to get out of fights. Like, all right, I'm done. Holyfield was not like that, and that's what puts him way above Tyson for me.
Yeah, you know, he was a very good hammer and a very good nail. Which, you know, in that era, you were either one or the other. Yeah.
I can't argue against Holyfield. I mean, the fact of the matter is you know, some people think he actually beat Lennox Lewis. You know, he did beat Bo. He did beat Mike Tyson, and he came up from a cruiserweight to do it. I mean, he's hard to argue against. I put him in there personally with the Charleses and the Walcotts and those kind of guys, because that's about the caliber that I think he is. But I don't have a problem with him being in the top 20 list. He's probably one of the only modern guys that I think is enough of a throwback that he should be there.
Okay. And now I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes or a little bit of time to toss in any names that I might have missed. I know that I eliminated Salvador Sanchez from my list. After looking at it, and it was Sanchez that got off the list so that I could put Joe Louis on it since I'd missed him. And obviously that's a no-brain change. But Sanchez is a guy, too, I think that, you know, dead at 23, there was just so much potential there that he may warrant a discussion at a later date. I know you guys have some people you want to put in the discussion, so I'll give it a Keith first.
My number one pick that I want to throw in there, I think I don't know if we included Ezra Charles or not, but we did talk about him. But outside of him, the guy that I want to throw in there is Mickey Walker.
Okay.
Mickey Walker was an animal. Mickey Walker was Duran before Duran. This is a guy that he's a welter and a middleweight champion. Fought Harry Grab. Supposedly had street fights with Harry Grab. Well, there's a lot of lore with that. Nobody really knows exactly what happened with it. But this is also a guy that fought for the light heavyweight title, lost to Tommy Loughran, and then moved up to heavyweight and had a draw with Jack Sharkey. So we're talking about a welterweight that had a draw with a heavyweight champion. He went like 4-5-0 with that one draw against heavyweights, and then he lost to Max Schmeling. Goes back down to light heavyweight and has a draw with Maxie Rosenblum, who was the light heavyweight champion. So this is a guy that pretty much went from welterweight to heavyweight and was competitive. So he's my guy that I think should possibly be in there.
Okay. I've passed. We're way over 16 at this point. We're in the 20 neighborhood. So.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Who do you think I want to add to this list?
Mike, I think you want to add Kid Chocolate.
What? Absolutely. And that's the Manny Pacquiao, of the early 1900s, late 1800s. Not only the only strike against him was his partying habits. This guy would literally go from a brothel. His trainers or fighters or whoever his handlers were would yank him out of a brothel and throw him into a ring, and he would. His speed and quickness, it was second to none.
Well, he had people waiting for him at the brothel.
Died of syphilis. I mean, it's this guy. Right from Havana, Cuba.
Look, I think there's a million great stories out there. Like one of the guys I find hard pressed to leave off the list is Barney Ross, actually, because I think he had a moment in the early 30s there where he was the best fighter on the planet. And the guys that he beat, Canzoneri, he beat McLarnin, 2 or 3 in the trilogy there, and just an incredible fighter. Again, another guy that went from one weight division to another, was one of the first with the in-between weight divisions there as well. So he had a couple of world titles in different places, and again, just the level of competition there when you're talking about guys like Canzoneri and McLarnin and things. I think Barney Ross could be. You can make an argument for him to be in this discussion as well.
I think Barney Ross is definitely. There's a couple of guys that people are probably going to listen and be like, why aren't they talking about them? There's 7 or 8 more that could be in here.
Well, let's just mention them first, so that at least we sound like a little bit like we know what we're talking about. Because, like I said, there's still some people. There's some people that I think you can get. I'll give you a real rudimentary argument, but you'll get my point. Somebody from our era might say, "Hey, who's the best? Who's the best is Arturo Gatti," and it's because he lived it. And if you lived it, you feel it differently. But when you look at it scientifically, Arturo Gatti is not the best fighter of this era. You know what I mean? It's like he may have been the most entertaining or whatever, but you can get that type of argument. And I want to eliminate some of that stuff and get into just the facts of the guys. Who really belongs in this discussion? So if we have 7 or 8 missing, let's spend another few minutes and go through some of those guys.
Probably the first one I would throw in there, and I have a hard time pronouncing his name, is the Brazilian Eder Joffre.
Okay.
Yeah, he's one that I think should probably be there. I'll let you guys throw in a couple, and I'm sure some will pop into my head immediately.
I really like the lightweights, man, personally. I mean, that's everyone that I believe should be on that list we've talked about. Now, you can sit here and make arguments for other fighters, but I'm honestly really content with that list.
Eder Joffre is an interesting choice for the list too. And if you consider, I think his real nemesis was fighting Harada, somebody who probably won't make this discussion, but it goes down in the discussion as maybe the greatest Japanese boxer of all time. Japan's got some phenomenal boxers right now in some of the lightweight classes and stuff, but Harada is enough of a legend I mean, and actually, in fact, Fighting Harada is the chairman right now. He's in his 70s or something like that, but he's the chairman right now of the Japanese Boxing Commission. So you're talking about a historical era there in the late 60s, early 70s when those fights were going down, and we don't have a lot of representation from that era, actually, so I think he's an excellent choice.
Yeah. I have there's one that I think we should throw in there, and since we're going back to the Joe Gans area, we can throw him in there, but Bob Fitzsimmons probably should be there. I mean, this is a guy that was a middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight champion, and he fought everybody. He fought Jack Johnson later on in his career, so he didn't have a color line. He didn't care.
Fitzsimmons is a guy, what I noticed, we seem to have cut this off like right around the gloved era. Like, Fitzsimmons is a guy who did a lot of his, because Fitzsimmons is a guy who did a lot of his fights without gloves, you know? And to me, once you're beyond that era, you're almost into a situation where I don't know how much like boxing those fights were going to be to what I recognize. I think they'd be almost a little bit more like, you know, an MMA type of thing. So I don't know. I don't want to discredit Fitzsimmons because he's a historic figure. And I love that history aspect of stuff. I think when the guys, you know, when you're going on the road,
you know. All right, go ahead.
Just real fast. I mean, when you're going on the road in the 1890s, and you're taking a boat to Australia, and you're going to get off the boat and say, all right, I'm going to box anyone here. You're just talking about men from a different, cut from a different cloth, you know? And you could toss in, if you go back a little further, you could toss in a guy, a truly historical figure. I don't know technique-wise that we know a lot about him, but a truly historical figure in that he traveled the world doing exhibitions and bringing boxing out, and that's a guy like Jem Mace.
Yeah, that's definitely, I don't know about in a boxing match, but he's definitely not the kind of guy I want to run into at the gas station.
Yeah.
Right. You know, man, I gotta stand corrected. My favorite fighter growing up of all time, Julio Cesar Chavez.
Yeah, I think he's a guy that we may be remiss for having left off of this discussion. I think,
yeah.
You know, I think
it's like for his name not even to be mentioned, even when talking about other fighters, is.
Yeah, no, I think he could definitely be a person here. I think, you know, for me the problem is that you know, as an American watching his run, and I got to watch a lot of his fights, and I enjoyed it and stuff. I was tainted a little bit by like, oh, you know, the Mexicans, they protect their fighters, and he's won 100 fights, but blah blah blah. Who's he fought?
Yeah, he's called paleteros.
Yeah, and
paleteros are ice cream vendors.
Yeah, and then you know, you get the, and then he got, I don't want to say he got lucky with Meldrick Taylor, but I mean, he was losing that fight, this is where the emotion comes in with me. I probably left him off the list because of just the memory, you know, and maybe he belongs on the list because he really, of the modern era.
Hey, Miguel, Meldrick Taylor, he won that fight. Chavez won that fight.
You know, but the thing is obvious. I mean, if you look at that fight, Meldrick Taylor was ruined. It's hard to argue.
It broke him.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, you know, then Meldrick goes on to become another of boxing's, you know, ugly tragedies and stuff.
Tragedies, yeah. You know, I mean, on a side note, we talked about Benny Leonard and Barney Ross earlier. They actually grew up in the same neighborhood in New York.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they came from that same ghetto. I would have liked to see some of them street fights back then. You know, just a little positioning, neighborhood positioning.
You know, ethnicity has a huge thing. Even in boxing today, you know, you could almost say, you know, there's a lot of, African Americans in boxing right now that hold a level that the Russians are coming over, or the Eastern Europeans and stuff. So even still now that there's an ethnic twist to it, but back then it was fierce. And I can tell you this, even going back deep into the ancient history of fighting, like into the 1700s, the Jews have a massive influence, like a massive influence, and it has to do with other things, aspects of their culture. You know, for example, we know a great deal about Daniel Mendoza, a bare-knuckle champion in England from the 1790s and stuff. And the reason we know about that is because he was Jewish, and the Jews were, you know, as a culture, documented their their culture as Jewish, so they made a big deal, not because they like boxing, but because there was a Jewish boxer doing well. And I think that carried over even till today. You still have guys, like Yuri Foreman and stuff, I think benefits from having that in his corner, so to speak, an ethnic tie in there. And in the 20s with Leonard and then with Ross and stuff, I think the Jews had their high point in boxing.
I agree.
Another guy we mentioned in there, and talking about ethnics, we could switch over to the Italians. We didn't talk. We mentioned him, but he didn't come up in a discussion. Does Canzoneri belong on this list?
I knew that was. Here's the thing. This goes back to Kid Chocolate. If Kid Chocolate's there, I have to throw Canzoneri in. Those guys are all so intertwined together that Canzoneri is a hard one to leave off. He's one of those that I struggle with big time, not putting on the list. He probably should be there, but I don't know who to take off.
I agree, and I have a boss who's of Italian background who's probably waiting for me outside the door right now.
You were nice about Marciano, though, so he's probably going to be all right with it.
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah, well, we'll see we'll see what we. But I think Canzoneri was the guy that we do want to talk about. Like I said, towards the end of his career, he did lose to McLaren. I think that elevated McLaren a lot. I'm a big, huge McLaren fan. I would put McLaren a notch below this discussion, which is for the greatest of all time. McLaren may have had his moment as maybe the greatest fighter on a given day sometime in the 30s, but not for the greatest of all time. I would leave McLaren off this list. I would probably put Canzoneri in that discussion. How about Montequilla?
Oh, Napolis?
Yeah, Jose Napolis.
That's another win that you got to give Monzon some credit for, even though it was over a welterweight. I personally put him as one of the top 3 to 4 welterweights of all time. I don't think that he makes that top 20 list, but I think he's pretty dang close.
Okay. One more name that pops into my head is, how about Dick Tiger? Dick
Tiger was, that's the thing. If you look at Dick Tiger later on in his career, he was sick. This is a guy. He was a monster. This guy was.
Yeah, all the way from Nigeria. Can you imagine where he came from? And what he's.
It's interesting. I look at a guy in the modern times right now, a guy who I find interesting like that because he's from Cameroon or something, and he's not a great. Let's say he's a good fighter for this time. He's not. Doesn't belong in this discussion generally. That's Sakio Bika, because that's a tough motherfucker, and use my French, you know what I mean? But it's that's a guy, he's one of the first guys I think of that is fighting today that I would take to a fight in 1880 because he would go. Like we talked about during, Mayweather would not show up at a fight in 1880 just to prove he's the best, you know what I mean? Bika would be like, all right, yeah, I'll do it. And he's a tough guy because he comes from poverty, he comes from, extreme situations. How much would that be amplified in the 60s with Dick Tiger? Because where he was coming from was just a place where I think he was born fighting, and you come up into, and it translates onto a world level. But I think that the experience of the man, traveling and doing the world thing at the time with the race and all the stigma and stuff, he carried a lot of pressure, and he handled it very well. Is there anybody else? We're going about an hour and 15 minutes here, which is
this
pretty...
thing is way too long. I guarantee you we're going to have to cut this one up into a couple different pieces.
We'll see how it goes. But anybody, let's not miss any names here. We got a couple of other ones that you want to toss out. If not, we'll start to wrap it up.
Off the top of my head, I think we hit pretty much everybody that I could think of. Of course you do have the guys that we didn't, your Jack Johnstons and Jack Dempseys that are borderline. They're great fighters, but it's kind of hard to put them in there, and it's also hard to not put them in there. But as far as there's not too many guys that I can't think of that we have.
I tell you what, man. I tell you who I'm glad is left off this list. Lennox Lewis.
Yeah, Lennox.
I hated watching him. I hated it.
I think he runs into a little bit of boring. I think, the fact that he was losing the Klitschko fight and or that most people think he was losing the Klitschko fight, and then it was stopped, and they
Avoid
never,
the ladies, man.
yeah,
Lennox Lewis.
and they never put on the rematch. And I think he also kind of suffered a little bit from an identity problem in terms of, I think he was wasn't he with the Olympics representing Canada and then became a Brit? You know, there's something there where like I don't think the Brits actually embraced him the way they should either.
Yeah, I could see him doing like a poodle walking business, you know, in a Boys Town type area.
See, I don't have a problem with Lewis. I actually like Lewis. Here's the thing: I like watching Lewis develop later on in his career because, you know, when you see when Emmanuel Stewart picked him up, he did get a bit more refined. And I don't put Lewis up there as my top batch of heavyweights.
No.
Lewis could have presented problems for a lot of guys based on his style, though.
I agree. And you know, I actually completely ruined the only time I met Emmanuel Stewart. I apologize, Emmanuel Stewart. Just my opening question about Lennox Lewis. He just looked at me and walked away.
All right, Mike, what gives? What was it?
I asked him about his proclivity, his dating proclivity.
Oh, yeah, that's not a good lead-off, Mike. Come on.
No, man, come on. It's a question I've been dying to know. He just looked at me. Yeah, I don't really get into, people's personal
Make sure that it's clarified that was Mike Davis instead of, in case I ever...
That was Keith Palmer that just said that.
That was Mike Davis 100% that said that.
Yeah, I met him at like this Bourbon Street bar in the south side of Chicago, and I was so excited. The only reason I bought a ticket to this event was to meet him. I met him, and I just completely blew my opportunity to get my picture taken with him. Yeah, he hid in the back room after that.
That's funny.
Yeah.
That's funny. I could see
He
Lennox.
thought I was a total jerk.
I could see Lennox Lewis walking up to you sometime in the future and saying, "Hey, aren't you the guy talking about this stuff?"
I would say to Lennox Lewis, let me see them underwear. I want to make sure there's no strings on the side.
It's like, hey,
That's what I would
Lennox,
say.
aren't you the guy talking about me and my dating habits? What about my great career and stuff? It's like, Lennox,
Yeah, I'm not interested.
your sins are the most interesting thing about you, Lennox. All right, guys, I appreciate it a great deal. I'm going to try. I don't want to drop names right now on the podcast because I don't know exactly how everything's going to go, but
It's going to go.
I'm glad we got a great pair of people here to do this job with. Next podcast where we refine and get more into details on some of these guys. I'm going to try to bring in a name from the boxing world, and like I said, I don't want to drop names just in case, but when we pull it off, this whole podcast thing is going to go hopefully to a whole new level. So I'm going to invite you guys back. What I'm aiming to do here is starting to produce these, and maybe they will be up on the web on Sunday mornings for a Sunday morning brunch kind of thing. You could eat breakfast and listen to some boxing talk from some guys who love the sport. I want to thank Keith for being with me. I want to thank Mike for being with me. I want to thank all the great guys that we mentioned on here for giving their lives and everything to the sport. And we will talk to you guys sometime in the next week.